Hey everybody, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks. We are on our final guild for our limited set review of Guilds of Ravnica. This time looking at Selesnya, the token makers, the go wide strategy. This is green-white, and thankfully we get a return in mechanic this time in Convoke. Convoke was originally the Selesnya mechanic for Ravnica City of Guilds back when Ravnica was originally released, and it was reused in M15, I want to say, as well. Convoke for newer players is very similar to Improvise if you played in Aether Revolt. It lets you tap your creatures to help pay for the mana cost of the Convoke cards. So you can see down below, the Convoke cards tend to have these really egregious mana costs, like the Arboretum Elemental is 9 mana, but Convoke lets you tap your creatures to pay for the mana. Each creature you tap pays for 1 generic mana or one of the colored mana that it shares. For instance, you can tap a green creature to help pay for the actual green mana on a Convoke spell, or you could tap a white creature to pay for white mana, but you could tap anything to pay for the generic mana, and you could theoretically just cast Convoke cards for free without tapping any lands if you have enough creatures to convoke them out. Convoke tends to be very fun to play. It's fun to get these big, huge mana cost creatures on board, and you'll see that things are adjusted for it, and you're not going to get what you normally get out of a 9 mana creature. If it has Convoke, you're going to get something that you would normally get for 6 mana, but you're looking for tokens. The more wide you can go in a Selesnya deck, the better your Convoke cards are going to be, and it's one of those threshold mechanics where you can only have so much Convoke in your deck without hurting the quality of your deck if you don't have a bunch of token generation or early game creatures. So you're prioritizing 1-drops, 2-drops, and you want a couple Convoke payoffs, maybe 4 to 5 big creatures or spells that have Convoke, but you can't go too hard on it. If you have too many Convoke cards and not enough early game, your deck's just not going to come together well. So moving right into Selesnya with our sideboard cards, our build-arounds, our unplayables, our cards that were not taken very highly or that we have to put a lot of effort in to make good. And thankfully, I only have to talk about one here. That is Pause for Reflection. This is a fog. It's 2 and a green. It's a common instant, and it has Convoke. So you could tap 3 creatures to pay for this, theoretically, one of which would have to be green. And it prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. The neat little trick here is that you could cast Pause for Reflection when you're tapped out. So if your opponent isn't aware of it, or if it's something that you sideboarded in and your opponent sees that you don't have any mana open or all of your lands are tapped, they may make a really risky swing, or they might make a swing that just looks like they're going to win the game, and then you could get them with this fog, but that's not even necessarily going to win you the game, right? I'm not a huge fan of this. I think it is a card you could sideboard in if you feel like you're going to get into racing situations, but for the most part, I don't like fogs, and I don't particularly like Pause for Reflection either. So moving straight out of that category into our low pick playables category. These are the cards that I'm picking up after the wheel, ones that I'm not prioritizing very highly, and even when I do get them, they're kind of filler material. I'm not super excited about them. The first one being Sumala Woodshaper, and I like starting off with this because it is a card I might be underrating a little bit. It's 2 green and white for a common 2/1 Elf Druid. It says when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or enchantment from among them, put it in your hand, and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So you get a really inefficient body with some card advantage tacked onto it. I really don't like this. I don't think 4 mana for a 2/1 is something I'm ever putting in my deck. And yes, this draws you a card, but you have to make sure you hit, or you have to have a pretty large number of creatures in your deck to make sure this is worthwhile. I guess these chain together, and there's potential it always replaces itself, but I think the power level of Guilds of Ravnica is going to be strong enough that you don't necessarily want to use your turn 4 only putting 2 power on board. Although, I can say this about every single creature in this video, or any white or green creature in this set, even if it's not in this video. Any creature has a small amount of playability to it when it comes to Selesnya, just because you can use basically any creature to convoke. So if you think about it, and your deck has a lot of convoke creatures, nearly every single creature in your deck is going to be able to tap for mana. So even the bad ones, and I'm not even sure Sumala Woodshaper is bad, but I don't like it. My initial gut reaction is that it's not great. Even though I don't like it, it's still good in a convoke deck because it does provide you a body that is essentially extra mana towards your convoke spells. Next up, we get to look at Locksdown Restorer. It's 4 double white for a 3/4. It is a common elephant cleric, so 6 mana 3/4, which obviously isn't really good, but you'll see this a lot. It has Convoke. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life, and that's an okay ability tacked on. I think the earliest you can get this down is possibly turn 3. If you can play a 1-drop and then something that makes 2 bodies on turn 2, and then you hit your land drop on turn 3, you could theoretically cast a 6 mana Convoke card as early as turn 3. But I don't think that curve out's going to happen too often. And unlike M15 or original Ravnica, there is not a huge amount of token generation. There's a little bit, and there are cards to support a Turbo Convoke deck. But for the most part, you should expect the Restorer to come down turn 4 through 6. If you have to pay 6 mana for this, it's not looking very good, but you could do worse than a 3/4 that gains you 4 life for possibly 4 or 5 mana. Similarly, we have Ledev Guardian. This is a 4 mana 2/4. It is a common human knight, and it has Convoke. That's all it does, no special abilities. Normally, I would say a 4 mana 2/4 is a filler card, and a 3 mana 2/4 tends to be a pretty decent card. And it's not like even if you play this card for free that it's adding a significant amount of power to the board. The fact that you can pay this, or pay 1 or 2 for this is fine, but I don't think the card is exceptional even when it's free. Next up, Venerated Shieldmate. This is 1 and green-white hybrid mana, 2 mana for a 2/2. It's a common, it's a human soldier, it has Vigilance. And that's a fine card. Vigilance isn't really an exceptional ability on a 2/2. What it does mean is that it usually persuades your opponent to block the creature, since if they want to attack you back, they have to get through that creature anyway. So normally when a 2/2 Vigilance attacks into your opponent's 2/2, they're going to take that trade. Shieldmate's a fine card. Again, anybody does something in Selesnya if you have those Convoke spells, but I'm not sure the Shieldmate is even better than the Boros multicolor card we saw. I think it was Fresh-Faced Recruit. That was 1 and a red-white hybrid mana for a 2/1, but it had First Strike on your turn, and I think that card is significantly better than this one. And we're out of early game territory into our middle range cards. These are cards that I'm getting a little bit more excited about actually putting in my deck, starting with, boom, Siegeworm is back. This card was in both sets that had Convoke, and here it is for the 3rd time with new art. Siegeworm is 5 and double green, 7 mana total for a 5/5 common Convoke Trampler. It's a worm, but doesn't really matter for the purposes of this set. Now, Siegeworm has been historically pretty good. This is one of the cards that, if you're playing a Convoke deck, you can be pretty sure that Siegeworm is good in your deck. In fact, a lot of people might even pick this card up early since they've played with it before and know that the power level is definitely there. The card is solid. There's nothing wrong with it. And as long as your opponent's not picking off all of your small early game creatures and you can get this down earlier than turn 7, then it should do a pretty good job of pressuring the opponent. Axe Favor is our giant growth of the set. It's 2 and a green for a common instant. It gives a creature +3/+3 until end of turn, and it has Convoke. Now, I really like combat tricks that have Convoke because people who don't play around them are going to get got by them pretty easily. It reminds me of the 1 green spell from M15 called Gather Courage, which was a single green to give a creature +2/+2 and had Convoke. People would run into that all the time, and a smart player will think if a Selesnya deck is tapped out, or a green deck in general is tapped out, but they have a couple creatures up, they could still represent Pax Favor. I think this card's fine, and I think as far as pre-releases go or early drafts in the format, people are going to run into it. So keep it in mind, especially with these instant speed Convoke spells, that even if an opponent's lands are tapped down, you've got to consider that some of these instant Convoke spells can still be cast, and Pax Favor is not one of the ones you want to run into. Following that up, we have Sprouting Renewal. This is 2 and a green for an uncommon sorcery. It has Convoke, and it says you choose one. Either create a 2/2 green and white elf knight creature token with Vigilance, or destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now, I should probably mention that there is not a lot of artifact or enchantment destruction in this entire set as far as things go, and there's not really a huge need for it. I do like this is artifact and enchantment destruction that you can just put in your main board and be happy with, and if you happen to run into an enchantment like Luminous Bonds or one of the enchantments that can lock a creature down, then this will take care of it. So I like that it's here, but if you have to cast this as a 3 mana 2/2, you could do worse. We already saw that a 2/2 Vigilance for 2 mana is not something I'm excited about, so a 3 mana 2/2 is not something I'm excited about either. But it has Convoke. You can play this on turn 2 pretty easily, and even though it's a sorcery, it will provide a little bit of leverage when it comes to certain artifacts and enchantments. There aren't a lot of artifacts floating around this set in the first place, as we'll see in the final set of videos, but I think you could do worse than putting this card in. Clearly, it's uncommon for a reason. The modal aspect of it definitely gives it a little bit of flexibility, and I think that makes it a fine main board inclusion, even if neither mode is going to be too exciting when it happens. Rosemane Centaur is a card that I think is probably just going to be solid. This is kind of your, bread and butter type cards for Selesnya. It is a common. It's a 3 green-white 4/4 Centaur Soldier, and it has Convoke and Vigilance. Vigilance, not too exciting on here, but Vigilance on a 4/4 is a lot better than Vigilance on a 2/2, since that body tends to rumble quite a bit, and a 4/4 blocker is pretty good when it's also attacking as a 4/4. 5 mana 4/4, quite good. I think you'll be able to convoke this out as early as turn 3 pretty often, and this is the type of card that rewards you for drafting your 1-drops and your 2-drops. If you play a 1-drop on turn 1, 2-drop on turn 2, then you can play this on turn 3, assuming you hit your land drop for turn 3, and I think a 4/4 Vigilance on turn 3 is a card that you're pretty happy with. I like the design of Convoke. It lets you do things like this, but you got to remember that your curve needs it. So Selesnya, just like Boros, is going to really value those 1 and 2 drops, whereas some other guilds might not be interested in them at all. Centaur Peacemaker is a card that looks like it's not that great, but probably going to play out just fine. It is 1 green-white for a 3/3 common Centaur Cleric, and it says when it enters the battlefield, each player gains 4 life. Keep in mind, in Two-Headed Giant, that's 8 life for each team, which kind of a slog to get through. But I think this is an okay card. 3 mana 3/3 does stack up pretty well in this format, and Selesnya can definitely make up for giving your opponent some extra life in the early game by beating down really hard with its Convoke creatures in the late game. So Peacemaker, you could do worse than. This is not the type of card I'm looking for when I'm drafting Selesnya, but it's the type of card that if I just need to draft some bodies and some efficient creatures, I'm fine taking it. Not super exciting, and I think people are going to look at this and give it a thumbs down because it does give the opponent life, but it gives you life to work with too, and it's the type of body that's able to get in there in the early game. Plus, again, sounding like a broken record, but any body will do for a Selesnya deck as long as you have the Convoke payoffs. Flower and Flourish is our first split card for Selesnya. It's the uncommon. The first half Flower is a single green or white mana for a sorcery, and it says search your library for a basic forest or plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. So, pretty basic. This is the type of card that when you have it in your deck, maybe you have 1 or 2 of, you can actually kind of skimp on your land count. I would be perfectly fine playing a Selesnya deck that had a Flower in it and also just 16 lands instead of 17, and I think that would work just fine. It's essentially a land drop, as long as you draw at least 1 other land. A little bit awkward, but it'll get the job done. Flourish, the second half, is 4 green-white for an uncommon sorcery. It says creatures you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. I've already mentioned Selesnya is the guild that cares about going wide, and even though we haven't seen a lot of cards that actually make tokens, there are a couple floating around this set, both in this video and the next couple videos, that encourage putting multiple creatures on board. And Flourish, although its sorcery speed and expensive, is the type of card that could just win you the game if your strategy is just putting a huge number of creatures on board. I think you'll cast Flower very often, and Flourish is aptly named, a little bit of a flourish on top of this card. 2 very different things you're looking at here, mana fixin versus go wide pumping, but they fit in the same deck just nice. They fit on different parts of the curve, and they give you access to 2 very unique effects, which overall combine to make a pretty good card. Join Shields is the type of card I feel like I'm going to like a lot more than most people. It's super expensive combat trick, but 3 green, white, 5 mana total for an uncommon instant, and it says untap all creatures you control. They gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. I'm just going to go on record for saying that I was a huge fan of Heroic Intervention from Aether Revolt. That was 2 mana, however, to give all your creatures hexproof and indestructible, but it did the trick. A lot of times you would use it as counter target removal spell or a counter target burn spell, or sometimes just make sure your creatures survive in combat. And in the best of times, you would use it to just wipe out a bunch of your opponent's creatures in the middle of combat or something along those lines. Join Shields is a little bit wonkier, and it adds the text of untapping all your creatures, which lets you kind of sneak a big block on the opponents when they might not have been expecting it, but it is super expensive. Holding up 5 mana is a tell, if nothing else. If you have a bunch of cards in hand and a bunch of tapped creatures, or you make a really weird attack into a bunch of your opponent's creatures, they've got to be thinking that you have this spell in your hand, so it's a little bit telegraphed due to how expensive it is, but I feel like the benefit's going to be there. World Soul Colossus is X green white for a 0/0. Ooh, 2 mana 0/0, love it. Uncommon elemental. It's pretty simple. It has Convoke, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So Convoke on an X spell is really sweet because it allows you to dump all of your creatures into it to increase the amount of mana for X, right? You can, of course, just use your lands, right? But then it comes down as a pretty weak creature. If you're tapping 3 for X, that's 5 mana total, and you're just getting a 3/3 out of the deal. And it's not like this thing has trample or evasion or anything, so a 5 mana 3/3 is not too exciting. 4 mana 2/2 looking pretty bad. 6 mana 4/4, still not too exciting, right? But when you start tapping your creatures for Convoke and add into X with your creatures, this card starts to look a little bit more appealing. My guess is that you'd have to Convoke this with at least 2 creatures before it starts to look like a card that you're happy to cast on curve. So, for example, if on turn 4 you have 2 creatures out and you pay 2 mana, or you pay green, white, and 2 for X, but you will also tap 2 creatures for Convoke, then X is going to be 4, and you'll get a 4 mana 4/4 essentially at the expense of tapping down some of your creatures. Or if you pay 3 for X, but you also tap 2 creatures along with it, you get a 5/5 for 5 in addition to tapping 2 creatures down. And you see the pattern here. If you're tapping at least 2 creatures in addition to what you would already pay by tapping out your mana, then you're getting a really efficient on-curve vanilla creature. And if you can tap more creatures than that, you get something even bigger. That's where it gets really exciting. If you go 1-drop on turn 1, 2-drop on turn 2, and then on turn 3 you play your 3rd land and tap anything, you're getting a 3 mana 3/3, which is just fine. This card has a lot of potential to always be a good on-curve threat, but it's never going to be insane, and it doesn't have trample, so I don't think it's one of the high power level cards we need to worry about. Arboretum Elemental. I really wanted to put this much higher than the same category as Siege Worm, but I know Siege Worm is good, and Arboretum Elemental is the type of card that I'm not 100% sure it's insane. The reason I say it's not as good as Siege Worm is because even with Convoke, 2 extra mana, a 9-drop instead of a 7-drop is quite a bit. And the biggest difference here, in fact, the only difference between this and Siege Worm is that you're trading Trample for Hexproof, and you're trading 2 points of power for 2 extra mana, or tapping down 2 extra creatures. Arboretum Elemental is almost always going to take at least 1 more turn to put down than your Siege Worm, and even with Convoke, 9 mana is a lot. Hexproof doesn't have a lot of ways to be abused in this set either. There are a couple fight spells, and that makes it pretty good, but 5 toughness isn't even a lot to take out, say, something in the mirror match without losing your Arboretum Elemental. And there aren't a lot of sick enchantments to put on this like there have been in some of the most recent formats, like things like On Sarah's Wings or Prodigious Growth. These are cards that rewarded you for having hexproof creatures in your deck. So I don't think Arboretum Elemental is ever going to be bad, but it is extremely expensive. I think possibly the most expensive Convoke spell in the set. And while Hexproof is a really strong mechanic, I don't think they really put the cards in here to abuse it, which makes it a Hexproof creature that I can kind of get behind. But for the most part, I'll have to wait and see whether the Trample on Siege Worm tends to be a little bit better than the Hexproof on this card before I really give the nod to one or the other. And moving out of Hexproof territory, we have our high power level cards. These are the cards that aren't quite bomb territory, and I'm not super stoked to first pick them, but they're quite good, and if I have to first pick them or pick them up in the first couple picks of the pack, then I'm pretty happy with it. First one is Flight of Equinox. This is 7 and a white for a 4/5. It is an uncommon human knight, and it has Convoke and Flying. So I like to think of this as the Flying Siege Worm. Instead of Trample, you get Flying, and Flying tends to be a significant amount better than Trample. So if you need a big finisher for your Convoke deck, this can be one of them. You'd probably take a couple of these, actually. And yes, 8 mana is more than 7, so this card is more expensive than Siege Worm, even if you're tapping creatures to pay for Convoke, but I think the payoff is there. If Siege Worm is a solid card, then I imagine Flight of Equinox is going to be a solid card, and the body's pretty good. It dodges 4 damage removal spells, which we'll see a couple of in the generic card video, and I think this is a card you'll be happy to first pick pretty early on, and then draft around it, making sure you have the early game creatures to Convoke it out. Following up the Equinox, we have Ledev Champion, 1 green and a white for a 2/2, uncommon Elf Knight. It says, whenever it attacks, you may tap any number of untapped creatures you control. It gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature tapped this way. You may also pay 3 green and a white to create a 1/1 soldier creature token with a lifelink. So I like this card for a lot of reasons. First off, it's kind of like the ability has Convoke for attacking, which is kind of neat, and I really like that they give the archetype a card that can use tokens for something other than just tapping for mana. So there, the design is kind of cool just alone. In addition to that, I think this card is going to attack just fine. A lot of times you play a 2/2 on turn 2, your opponent plays something like a 2/3 or a 0/5 or something like that you can't really attack into too well, and at least Ledev Champion gives you something to do with those creatures that can't attack. Maybe those Vigilance creatures too, something that works pretty well with this, since you can attack with this and other Vigilance creatures, and then also tap your Vigilance creatures to make Ledev Champion a little bit better. Something to look back on that 2 mana card we saw at the beginning of the video for. And it just has a nice little mana sink here. Being able to pump out tokens is no joke, even if the ability is expensive. And spoiler alert, that's not the last time I'm going to say that before the end of this video. But even though it costs 5 mana for a 1/1, if you're not doing anything else with your mana, that's quite a good mana sink to have. And plus, you can use those tokens on the same turn that you create them to make this a little bit bigger. I think Ledev Champion is a card you're very happy to take early on, and even though it doesn't necessarily push you down a Convoke path the same way some other Selesnya cards will, I think it's going to play quite well in the same decks. Camaraderie is a rare. It's 4 green-white for a sorcery. Gotta love 6 mana sorceries. It says, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures you control. Also, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Now, I've already mentioned with the first split card, Flourish, I believe, was the second half. That gives +2/+2 for 6 mana at sorcery speed. This gives +1/+1 for 6 mana at sorcery speed. So if I wasn't too high on the +2/+2, then I'm not too high on the +1 from this card. But this does a lot more than that. You gain X life and draw X cards equal to the number of creatures you control. I think if you have even just 3 creatures on board when you cast this, 6 mana, draw 3 cards, gain 3 life, and pump your team for the term seems pretty strong, and it shouldn't be too hard for Selesnya to have a lot more than 3 creatures. This is probably push and bomb territory, and I wouldn't be surprised if this card is actually just fantastic. Plus, it's kind of hard to get blown out in response to this. Unless your opponent has an instant speed sweeper, which I'm not sure there are any in this set, then you're going to draw those cards and gain a bunch of life, and I think that's pretty good. The reason I don't call it a bomb, even though it seems like it has bomb-type text written on it, is that if you top cut this and you maybe just got your board swept or you don't have creatures on board, maybe you only have 1 creature, then it loses just an absurd amount of its value. This card is going to be good with 3 or more creatures on board, and sometimes it's going to push the envelope to the max, and I just think that it's the card you're going to be happy first picking, but the type of card that in gameplay, sometimes it's going to let you down. Next is Conclave Guildmage, green and a white mana for a 2/2 Elf Cleric. It's an uncommon like the rest. First ability is green and tap. Creatures you control gain trample until end of turn. Just fine, especially when some of your Convoke creatures need trample to be super relevant. And it also has 5 and a white tap. Create a 2/2 green and white Elf Knight creature token with Vigilance. So, nice that this shows up on the screen at the same time as Ledev Champion. Not intentional, but glad I get to talk about them side by side. I already said that 5 mana activated ability to make a 1/1 is something that you would be interested in on a card that's already pretty playable. 6 mana to make a 2/2 doesn't sound like you're getting a huge deal, but mana sinks are important. In these sorts of formats, especially when you're playing the guild that tends to stall the game by making a bunch of creatures and tokens and just clogging up the board, having a mana sink on board, even if it doesn't make the most efficient bodies in the world, is fantastic. And that's why all the guild mages are great. And the Conclave Guild Mage's second ability is something that Selesnya really needs, right? Constant token generation. You need to be able to put bodies on board, not just for Convoke, but for your cards that like Camaraderie and Flourish that pump your entire team and give them some wide sweeping effect. The Guild Mage is great. So the second ability is what I'm super excited about, but even the first ability is threatening. I already complained that the hexproof creature didn't have trample, and well, here's a way to give all your creatures trample. Seems like it's going to play out pretty well. I think this is a high pick and definitely a reward for playing Selesnya. Ooh, Conclave Cavalier is a card I'm super excited to lose to. It's green, green, white, white, so the hard to cast and not Selesnya version of this cycle. It is a 4-mana 4/4 essentially. It is uncommon, it's a Centaur Knight, and it has Vigilance, plus when it dies, you create 2/2 green and white Elf Knight creature tokens with Vigilance. So what can I say? This is just a good card, right? A 4-mana 4/4 that dies into 2/2/2s with Vigilance, and it has Vigilance itself. It attacks great. Your opponent can't just sit there and take 4 over and over and over, so at some point they're going to have to block or maybe double block. You trade this off, and boom, you just replaced your 4/4 with some 2/2s. It splits up like a Metotic Slime, and suddenly you have 2 creatures that can either keep attacking, they can block, or you can use them to Convoke. So this card seems fantastic in Selesnya. I think it's an awesome design. Definitely one of the better ones as far as this cycle goes. I think it's a little bit better than the Boros one and the Golgari one, and seems like a huge beat. And I don't want to run into this card too often. I think it's that absurd, but still not quite pushing bomb territory. It can just get slapped with the Luminous Bonds, and if you don't have sacrifice outlets, then it's going to look a little bit sad. But hey, almost every time you play this card, it should be a beat-in for the opponent. Second split card for Selesnya, our rare, is Assure and Assemble, or Assure or Assemble, I don't know. The first half, Assure, is green, white hybrid mana, 2 mana for a instant. It says put a 1/1 counter on target creature. That creature gains indestructible until end of turn. I generally like these effects. A lot of times I'll just play a green spell that gives a creature indestructible and put no +1/+1 counter on it, giving it some sort of lasting effect in addition to just making sure it doesn't die, is decent. It's not great, right? That's the type of thing I would expect out of a common or uncommon, so it's not insane or anything like that. But let's look at Assemble. Assemble says 4 green-white, instant, create 3 2/2 green and white Elf Knight creature tokens with Vigilance. Now, once you get to 6 mana, it starts to look a little bit less appealing that you can Convoke out some of your 7 or 8 mana cards because you're getting to the point where you could cast them naturally. But Selesnya has a second game plan in addition to just casting Convoke cards. It likes to go wide, and making 6 power and toughness for 6 mana seems like it's really good. The thing that really sells me on this is that Assemble is an instant, and I do think you're going to hold this in your hand quite often to get to Assemble rather than trying to cast Assure. If it comes out that you can blow your opponent out or you just really need a pivotal creature, then you can use Assure to make sure that creature survives. But I think Assemble is the game plan when you're drafting this card, and I think when you do cast it, it's going to be great. This is almost Selesnya removal too, since at instant speed you add 6 power to the board. And anytime you can do that, you get to set up a bunch of blocks against your opponent's creatures that they might not have been expecting. Imara, Soul of the Accord, is green-white, 2 mana for a 2/2 rare, legendary elf cleric. It says whenever Imara, Soul of Accord, becomes tapped, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with a lifelink. I really like this card. It's perfect for Selesnya because you're going to be incentivized to tap it down for Convoke, and anytime you tap it for Convoke, boom, you get to create another white 1/1, which fits both things that Selesnya wants to do. It creates tokens, so it goes wide, and it also gives you more creatures for Convoke. Amara is a fantastic card, and keep in mind, even if you're not tapping this for Convoke, sometimes you just attack with it and you get a 1/1. Anytime it becomes tapped at all, boom, you get a 1/1. And finally, we get to push into the bomb territory, the cards that I'm most excited to talk about, namely the Mythic Rares and a couple other rares, starting off with March of the Multitudes. I don't think anybody's questioning about this being a mythic rare. It's kind of absurd, right? It's X, green, white, white. So 3 mana plus X mana. It's a mythic, it's an instant, it has Convoke, and the effect is create X 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. This is a huge blowout. This is exactly what Selesnya wants to do. It's token generation with Convoke that helps with Convoke all tied in one card. This is your game finisher when you draft this card. If you can cast this and make a bunch of tokens and then untap with an effect like Camaraderie or an effect like Flourish, you basically just win the game. Not to mention it's instant. You get to do this as a combat trick if you really want to. You do not want to cast this in the early game and just get like 2 soldiers. You want to build out a huge board, wait until your opponent passes the turn, and then make 7, 8 plus tokens with this effect and just crush your opponent from there. I think this card is amazing. It seems like one of the strongest cards in the set to me, and I think it's going to be a slam dunk first pick no matter what. Venerated Locksdown is 4 and a white for a 4/4 rare Elephant Cleric. It has Convoke, and it says when it enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on each creature that convoked it. Another really cool design for Convoke, paying you off for actually tapping down the creatures rather than just paying you off with the creature you get. Convoke in out a Venerated Locksdown seems like it's going to be fantastic. A 4/4 for 5, already pretty good. I would play that some amount of the time, even with no abilities. Give it Convoke on top of that, and you're often seeing a 4/4 on turn 3 or 4, which is even better. And then on top of that, you get to basically Anthem your board, and with a permanent Anthem too. If you imagine playing 1 drop on turn 1, 2 drop on turn 2, 3 drop on turn 3, and then convoking all of your creatures to get this out on turn 4, you've made a 4 mana 4/4 and put a 1/1 counter on your first 3 plays of the game. So Venerated Locksdown is one of those cards that has sick curve out potential, and even in the late game, if you get to the point where you can tap 5 creatures, just straight up pay for the entire cost of the Locksdown, then all those creatures are getting bigger, and you're adding, 9 power to the board? I think that's the most you can get out of this, is the 4 power from this, and up to 5 additional counters for tapping 5 creatures. So yeah, you can get 9 power and 9 toughness for your 5 mana card here, and that's a really huge ceiling for a card like this. Knight of Autumn is our next card. It's 1 green white for a 2/1. It's a rare, and it is a Dryad Knight. It says when it enters the battlefield, choose one of the following 3 abilities. You can either put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, you can destroy target artifact or enchantment, or you gain 4 life. This card is amazing, and even though none of the effects are particularly extremely powerful or anything like that, the flexibility is enough to say that I'm always first picking this card. And while most of the time I think you're going to play this as a 3 mana 4/3, it gives you a bunch of other options, and I love it. It's the type of card that you're happy to recur with something like Find or Finality, and the more you can recur it, the better it gets, but it gives you a lot of options, and that is when you get to bomb territory. Conclave Tribunal is not a flashy card, but I think it's close enough to a first pick as you can get for a removal spell. It's 3 and a white for an enchantment. It's uncommon, and it says when it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and it has Convoke. This is one of the few enchantments in the entire set that's worth main board and removal for, and you'll see that I don't think we're main board in artifact and enchantment removal in this set. So a lot of times your opponent won't have an answer to this unless they have something like Knight of Autumn. Plus, there's not a lot of enchantment or artifact removal outside of green anyway, so if your opponent's not playing a green deck, then Conclave Tribunal is just going to be hard removal for basically the entire game. Plus, it gets rid of non-creature spells as well. Anything that's not a land. If you played with Hieromancer's Cage in M19, then boom, here's your Hieromancer's Cage. And it has Convoke, so you could play this potentially for free. It's a nice removal spell for little weenie decks because it gets past those big creatures. It gives you an out to those creatures that your smaller creatures can't always attack into. And it's just a card that most decks are going to be interested in. Boros is going to play this, Selesnya is going to play this, non-white decks are going to splash for it. It's going to be good no matter what, and it's definitely a removal spell that you're happy to first pick. And our final card here, the other Selesnya Mythic, befittingly, is Tristana Discordant, 3 green and a white, 5 mana total, for a 1/4 Mythic Dryad. It's legendary. Ooh, 5 mana 1/4, sounds great. Now, it has a bunch of abilities. It says, first off, other creatures you control get +1/+1. Second off, when it enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. And finally, for some reason, it says at the beginning of your end step, each player gains control of all creatures they own. Okay, not 100% sure why that last ability's tacked on, but seems like it's a plant for constructed reasons. I'm not entirely sure why that's there, but hey, it's there, right? At any rate, think about what you get with this card just on its own. Between itself and the 2 1/1s that you get, which are going to get pumped, you get what? 5 power and 8 toughness worth of creatures for 5 mana. That's already pretty absurdly high. You get 3 bodies, which is going to be fantastic for Selesnya. That makes your Convoke spells extremely castable just on its own. And in addition to the 5/8 total power toughness you get from the card alone, you pump the rest of the creatures you already had. So a lot of times you're going to get something like 7/8 power off of this card and like 10 or 11 toughness. So your opponent's going to have to kill this before they kill anything else. And it's adjusted accordingly. It's a 1/4 on its own, so it's very killable. But if they don't kill it, your creatures are just going to be impossible to deal with. Plus, those tokens have lifelink. You've got 4 points of lifelink on board for a 5-mana card, and that's not counting the other bonuses. Now, this can also be used against Dimir. There are maybe 2 or 3 Dimir cards that let you cast your opponent's cards. There was the split card that lets you take a creature with converted mana cost 2 or less. There is the Spectre that lets you cast cards when it deals damage. And there's also the mythic rare, the mnemonic something or another that lets you cast cards out of your opponent's graveyard. This last ability on Tristana Discordant has a little bit of gameplay against them. So if your opponent doesn't know that you have this card and they've taken one of your creatures in a Dimir deck, then you can drop this and get your creatures back. But for the most part, that last line of text is not really going to matter. The power is there in the first 2 abilities, and that is definitely some power to have. Slam Dunk first pick, another card contending for one of the top spots in this set, and I imagine it doesn't really need a lot of justification to be there. And that covers everything for Selesnya. So all the guilds are knocked out, but remember, the cards that I have reviewed up to this point were cards that were tied specifically to a guild. They were either gold cards or they were watermarked and had the ability of that guild. So everything here was either a Selesnya gold card or a Convoke card. We're going to see in the next 2 videos, it's going to be a 2-parter because there's still a lot left, that we're going to look at all the other cards. These are going to be all monocolor cards from every combination of colors, and the artifacts and lands. So stay tuned. It's going to be a 2-parter. We got a lot to talk to, but at least those cards are a little bit less complicated since they don't have guild mechanics on them. We're going to talk about the cards in context of the sets that they would be best in, or the guilds that they would be best in, so keep that in mind. Just because we didn't talk about a card here doesn't mean that some of the other cards are designed with Selesnya in mind. We're going to see a lot of that, but stay tuned for all of the rest of Guilds of Ravnica. Part 1 and Part 2 coming up. Thanks for watching. My name is Timothy. Feedback always welcome on the videos. Appreciate those of you who spent your 40 some odd minutes watching each of these videos for some reason. Not exactly succinct, but I feel like if I have something worth saying, that maybe it helps somebody out, especially since Selesnya has a lot of these combat tricks. But enough rambling. My name's Timothy with Mana Rocks. Thank you for watching. See you next time.